I'm really happy to be here. I'm prompted to tell you about two words that don't appear in either of my books. Princeton University Press asked me to take out the word hermeneutics from doctors' stories. And being young then, 25 years ago or so, I did. And you won't find the word intuition in how doctors think. No. And I have to say that's because I'm a girl. And you don't spend 35 years teaching in a medical school and going around mentioning the word intuition. You wait until the gray-haired white men begin to use it too. And it's just a delight to hear both those words here today. So I guess I'm always happy to be invited to speak, but I'm really happy to be here. Thanks. My field is English literature, and I'm a Mac user too, so we'll try this. In fidelity to my degree of origin, I have an epigraph. It's from George Eliot's magnificent novel, Middlemarch, a 19th century novel that she began to write as a novel about medicine. It turned out to be much bigger than that, but it contains this interesting bit of dialogue. I guess it's dialogue. The heroine's father, Mr. Brooke, was something of a hypochondriac, and here he is carrying on at his dinner table, saying, well, you know, Standish, every dose you take is an experiment, you know, an experiment. Oops, let me go back. I don't know how to go back. Ah, good, okay. I want to begin with the obvious. Medical practice is based on scientific facts that in the best cases, but not all, are bound by theories of how the body works and how substances and interventions will affect the body. This was true before our time, even in earliest medical history, when the facts were not what we now regard as scientific, and the theories were largely mistaken. But even in our scientific age, someone possessed of factual knowledge and an explanatory theory of them is not thereby a physician. Then and now, those others may include mothers, other anxious family members, basic scientists, especially those who teach medical students, and the worried well, even hypochondriacs. But to practice medicine, to be a clinician, another intellectual capacity is required. Those biological sciences we regard as foundational in the care of the sick may be necessary, and the statistical studies that buttress them may be helpful, but they're insufficient for clinical practice. The knowledge needed for the care of patients is practical knowledge, experiential knowledge, knowledge that arises from having been in this particular spot, even if that's by extension, acquired vicariously from the reports of others. Clinical research, especially meta-studies and the Cochrane Collaborative, aggregate these cases, and practical knowledge, what Aristotle called phronesis, enables a clinician to put general scientific knowledge and particular case-based information about this patient together in an effective way to diagnose and to treat the illness. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics identified, how do I get rid of that? Yeah. He identified 5 intellectual virtues, and these are 3. Phronesis is the central one for clinical judgment. I think of it lying between episteme, science, and techne, art, craft. All are useful in medicine, but phronesis is the essential one. It's the intellectual virtue of determining what to do in uncertain circumstances. And Aristotle, since he's writing about ethics, only mentions health care, the care of the preservation and restoration of health, and navigation as analogs, but we take the lesson. I think contemporary thinkers might add meteorology coming from the Gulf Coast of Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico. I'd put meteorology in here, based on science, but prognostication is another matter. As you probably know, episteme is the source of our word epistemology, and I kind of think what we're doing here today is constructing a phronesiology. I'd love to see that word take hold. To confuse the two, epistemology and phronesis, science knowing and experiential knowing in the care of patients, is to misunderstand the work of clinical medicine, the work that physicians do. Clinicians must act, and in order to do so, they must leave unexamined some really interesting details of scientific and epistemological and philosophical interest. Intellectual inquiry and scientific investigation must stop, although curiosity may provoke research later when those same clinicians, who are also philosophers of medicine, reflect on their experience when they're not in the presence of patients. The stopping rule is sometimes evoked by an imperceptible click, the recognition of the knowledge needed to treat, but often it takes a little longer. Whether long or short, fast or slow, when it comes to the stop, defines medicine as a practice. Here's a sketch of diagnostic reasoning and its acquisition. It was made more than 20 years ago by John Santo Pietro, who was a student in a Sherlock Holmes and clinical judgment seminar that I taught at Northwestern. It captures the acquisition of clinical reasoning as well as the tension between general rules and the particular details of the patient's case. It's my all-time favorite slide. The x-axis is a timeline. Over to the left, you'll see John has written us, meaning second-year students just beginning to learn physical diagnosis. And farther to the right is what Maria called a local legend, John Clark, J. Clark, who'd come to the seminar the week before to talk about his work. You notice he's not quite to the perfection end of the scale. I think John's position was that that's an aspirational goal that probably nobody ever reaches, not even Watson. The open books are the patient and the patient's account of the illness. The clinician's store of knowledge is represented by the volumes in the bookcase. And important for our purposes, the process of clinical reasoning is represented by the arrows circulating between them. It took me some time to notice that the top arrows fatten as they go to the right. That is, the arrows at the top represent the moment that the diagnosis is made. In fact, that's how he's labeled it, diagnosis, parenthesis, interpretation. And in John Clark's stage, it's quite fat and confident. But the arrows that circulate between the bookcases and the open book of the patient are of different sizes too, and that's important. The more you have stored in your collective, your memory collection, the stronger the evidence that can proceed from there to the interpretation of the patient, and the less you need, following up on what many of you have said about, especially Jeff Norman, about the speed of the recognition. The smaller the arrow can be, the more expert you are. I saw some iPhones out. Don't use this. I have permission to use it, but I haven't asked for permission to put it in print, so I don't know how you would attribute it. But John Santo Pietro, contrary to my expectation, did not go into general internal medicine. He's a psychiatrist, and you can find him in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's head of that state's mental health services. Santo Pietro. Write him and ask him. He'll be really flattered. In 1993, when he did this, some decisional aids were available, but the ones that we take for granted today were not even, well, they were barely in sight. So let's imagine that some of the shell volumes have been updated with the Cochrane collaboration results, and that there's some CDs with meta-studies tucked in back pockets in the back covers of some of these volumes. These meta-studies that aggregate a heretofore unimaginable amount of research can now fatten the arrow on the right side of each interchange, as well as the reliability of the diagnosis that's represented by the top arrow that leads to therapeutic action. But with or without contemporary aids and augmentation, the basic diagnostic movement remains that hermeneutic or interpretive circle between the bookshelves and the open book, moving back and forth between the particular manifestation of the patient's illness and the physician's store of general scientific and experiential clinical knowledge. This slide is quite crude. I'm waiting for the graduate student or the grandchild who can design me a slide that makes a spiral. If any of you know how to do this, I'd love to know. I realize I should have asked Tim Quill, who's kind of my go-to person for weird slides, but I forgot to ask him. I need the spiral in order to capture the narrowing inquiry, the spiral that moves back and forth with questions and checking between patient and the store of knowledge. It's characteristic of diagnostic thinking. The clinician considers the details of the illness and the diagnostic narrative that they constitute, and compares them against the taxonomy of illness scripts stored in memory. Those illness scripts, narrative accounts of recognized diseases, and I want to say that the narrative is important. People, I really understand, especially if you're talking about instant recognition, why you talk about pattern recognition. But the distinctive thing about narrative, unlike pattern, is that it's got a time element. And time, if you've wrestled with the bullet representation of narrative on an electronic medical record, it's not narrative. It hasn't got, except top to bottom, hasn't really got the the unfolding of the diagnostic plot. In any case, those illness scripts that are accounts of recognized diseases are in turn tested against the details of the patient's illness. And the match, the recognition, may be the blink that Malcolm Gladwell, drawing on the work of Gerd Gigerenzer, describes. Or the diagnostic inquiry may spiral back and forth between general data and the particular details until a diagnosis is reached. Jerome Cassirer, decades ago, when he was first beginning to study learning clinical reasoning, described how the deliberations of nephrologists considering a case of kidney failure constituted very abbreviated spirals. He didn't describe the circle and he didn't talk about a spiral, but the data's there, the evidence is there. The nephrologist took no time at all, 3 to 5 questions. While cardiologists that he somehow got to agree to consider a case of kidney failure took 4 times longer. They went back and forth asking questions that, you just want to send them even through the pages of the academic journal, some hints on ask about aspirin use. But they finally get around to it. And they all, cardiologists as well as nephrologists, reach a diagnosis, the right diagnosis. That's when inquiry stops. It's time to act. Clinical judgment is customarily associated with fast thinking, with gut feelings or intuition. and I have a slide for that. Turns out quite apropos. There. Stanovich's book from 2004, preceding Daniel Kahneman's, which he acknowledges quite freely. Fast thinking, or intuition, the philosophical history of which Hillel Brody has just recently traced in a book called Intuition in Medicine from the same press. Critics are rightly suspicious of it, but in practice, where fast thinking or pattern recognition is quite common, clinical judgment is hedged around with all sorts of slow thinking, speed bumps on the way to diagnosis. Physicians construct differential diagnoses, they order tests, they rule out what's logically impossible and flag the improbables. These intellectual activities involve the use of logic, deduction, which makes the whole enterprise feel like a science, but it's not. Certainly, it's rational, even if not a science, but those isolated operations of logic are not enough to constitute medicine as itself a science. Actually, they're not even deduction, except localized, but rather a part of C.S. Peirce's abduction, which I'm pleased to have heard a lot about today. This is a logical but primarily interpretive operation that starts from an effect and reasons backward to determine its cause. Retroduction is also used by lawyers, moral theologians, ethicists, their modern manifestation, and detectives, all of whom are engaged in a profession that must fit individual cases into an overarching theory of the world, human behavior, social custom, the understanding of illness. In addition, retrospective reasoners have to do this under conditions of uncertainty. In fact, John Ladd, who I believe was at Boston University, once said that the characteristic thing about this sort of reasoning is that the confirmation has to proceed in the same field where the data were first gathered, which is very unscientific, anti-Claude Bernard, for instance. And of course, the reasoning from effect to cause involves, as John Santo Pietro's sketch suggests, a hermeneutic or interpretive circle that relies on both thinking fast and thinking slow. Clinical reasoning is chock full of slow thinking and speed bumps. Differential diagnoses, tests, and rule-outs are not the only examples. These days, they're checklists, far more acceptable than protocols, but they're protocols too, and algorithms. Students have long been taught to consider especially serious diagnoses higher in the differential than their prevalence on their own would suggest. Physicians can make a point of asking themselves the question Jerome Groopman recommends to patients. What else could it be? Not asking it near the beginning of the diagnostic process, where it's implicit in the very construction of the differential, but later, after closing in on the diagnosis. The two docs in Australia who have the internal medicine reasoning podcast are fond of this strategy. Overwhelmingly, they're the studies, especially the studies of randomized controlled trials, the Cochrane collaboration reports, meta-studies, statistics generally, all of which work to inform and slow diagnostic thinking. Yet clinical judgment is always there. It's pervasive. It's there even in the speed bumps themselves. The statistics and study results are weighed against experience. How closely does this patient resemble the study cohort? What about comorbidities, age, gender? Even the methodological construction of that best of all age to slow thought, the differential diagnosis, is suffused with judgment. Got it. What goes into the differential, and in what order? I once heard Larry Weed, whom we lost earlier this month, admonish a chief resident who was brilliant. She could only think of 28 causes of headache, and he was working on his problem knowledge couplers, he could name 90. But he wasn't seeing patients, and she was. Clinical judgment reduced the list. What's more, there's crossover between fast thinking and slow thinking. The results of slow thinking are learned and absorbed into practical reasoning. They inform the blink. And meanwhile, evidence-based medicine enthusiasts identify a habit that they need to know more about and head off to research about it. Once a week is recommended. Clinical judgment determines where this diagnostic process stops. The physician judges that she has, at least tentatively, the knowledge needed to treat. Physicians regard this decision as obvious, since making a diagnosis is their ethical and professional goal. It might be too soon, it might be mistaken, but right or wrong, the decision to stop confirms clinical medicine as a practice and not itself a science. Biomedical scientists wouldn't stop, nor would epidemiologists, and philosophers of medicine wouldn't stop either. We'd want to consider that the diagnosis or the information it's based on is partial, uncertain, often subjective, open to revision. Clinicians might think of this if they're interested in philosophy of medicine, but not while they're seeing the patient. The pervasiveness of clinical judgment throughout patient care is in part the reason Alvin Feinstein recommended that the profession of medicine attend to medical-based evidence. Oops, there's Sherlock. He wrote, "Intact human beings require a drastically different set of investigative procedures which cannot be extrapolated or derived from laboratory methods. A new and entirely different kind of methodology is needed, a kind of bottom-up." Oops. How do I do that? There's not time. Here's what he says next. Well, I can't get there. There. No, up here.
Oh, you want to go back to that one?
Yep, thank you. Sorry.
This one here.
All right. And to finish with Feinstein, all the basic issues, he said, were qualitative. The new procedures will emerge from descriptive solutions to the basic problems in clinical data and clinical taxonomy. We go to the doctor in search of clinical judgments. What patients need, what we desperately want often, is precisely that judgment and the attention to our situation that it requires. Is this serious, doc? Is this more or less normal? What should I do? This is why the care of patients will not be turned over to robots. Artificial intelligence can aid enormously in diagnosis and the choice of treatment, but its products must be used judiciously. All medical treatment, as Mr. Brooke tells his dinner guest, is to some extent experimental. Not experimental in what's generally understood, what's known about its efficacy. It's experimental in its effectiveness for this particular patient. Clinical decisions depend on the exercise of phronesis, of clinical judgment. A reliable stopping rule is the ethical obligation of clinical practice. Clinical judgment is essential to its exercise. Thank you. Miriam is getting up because we're going to have a panel. Oh.
I'm very glad you ended it with the artificial intelligence theme, because indeed I would suspect that oncoming in the literature there will be more and more defenses of the aspects of expertise that might not be as easily defined in ways that AI can take over. But is perhaps this the best use of our time? I'm wondering if we're being defensive in some ways in terms of how we're dealing with the AI that is replacing a number of individuals in the types of jobs they're having, including teachers, including police people, including judges, including ... And, yes, exactly. So again, I'm trying to be devil's advocate to some extent. Are we going to be seeing more and more defenses of the human aspects, quote unquote, of decision making, so as to make sure that our jobs are secure for as long as we can possibly keep them secure? Thank you.
I don't think I'm being defensive. John Fuller asked me yesterday if I thought clinical intuition was a pre-scientific phenomenon that was outdated, or was it still around, part of clinical judgment? And I think the history of health care, in the human history of health care, is a matter of improving and shaping and correcting and informing clinical judgment with whatever we can lay our hands on. And it's been science, and then it's been social science in the form of clinical research, artificial intelligence, well, all the statistical things that are possible with computer power get added to it. And now it's artificial intelligence. Bring it on. But I think with all these things, it doesn't reduce the fact that we're going to still have to make sense of it. And doctors are needed for that. It's been a long afternoon. Let's have a panel. Oh, Jeff? Oh.
Quickie. There is a literature on diagnostic errors, typically where people go through charts. Mark Graber's an example of this. Go through charts where some egregious error had been committed and go looking for cognitive biases. Far and away, the most common cognitive bias that is identified is premature closure.
Right.
I've often wondered what they mean by that. You're essentially arguing, though, that a part of expertise is, in fact, appropriate closure.
Right. You don't want to have late closure either. You don't want to fail to stop and go off to your lab and do an experiment on your patient before you go back and tell them that they have
Or
an
do
infection.
a Medline search and then a systematic review and then go back to your patient.
Right. Right.
Do you have any thoughts about this idea of what this thing called premature closure might mean?
Well, I bet you do, because with all your data about fast thinking, that seems to be a danger. I may have been having drunk too much dual process theory, that there are errors, and maybe it comes from deciding too soon. I'm much more worried about anchoring, going in with a conception and deciding too soon and sticking with it and not being open to other possibilities.
But I think you just identified one of the issues around the whole cognitive biases literature: anchoring, confirmation bias, premature closure, ignorance of base rates. It's kind of all the same thing.
Sure.
It's a very inadequate taxonomy.
Well, maybe you've just given them a meta category, and there may be people looking at it may be able to distinguish. I don't. It seems quite rough to me as well.